Welcome to the third of our reflections on the Old Testament story of Naaman. And if you haven't managed to already, you might find it helpful to watch the first two before following this one. And this time we're going to look at this episode from the perspective of Naaman himself, a man who has seen two very distinct sides of this story. At one level for him, it has been a narrative of despair. Despair as he discovers for all his power and status, he has a devastating skin disease that could rob him of everything. Despair as he arrives at the courts of the king of Israel, desperately seeking a cure, only to be met with threat and suspicion as the king accuses him of seeking to set a trap and rips his clothes in symbolic outrage. And yet it's also been a story of hope. A story of hope as his wife informs him that a young captive slave girl has told her that the prophet Elisha will be able to cure him. Hope as the king of Syria agrees to send him in a delegation to Israel with letters and gifts to secure him the favour he needs. And now he arrives at the house of Elisha the prophet. His hopes once again are raised, and having witnessed the failure of every other power structure, all he has to do is throw himself at the mercy of the prophet and do whatever he says. So let's take a look at the story as we read the final instalment from 2 Kings chapter 5 verses 9 to 14. So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger to say to him, "Go, wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored and you will be cleansed." But Naaman went away angry and said, "I thought he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the spot and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed?" So he turned and went off in a rage. Naaman's servants went to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, 'Wash and be cleansed'?" So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him. And his flesh was restored and became clean, like that of a young boy. Now, here's the thing. We all know that he was cured. But I want to invite you to wind the tape back, so to speak, to that moment where once again Naaman's well-being hangs in the balance. He arrives at the house of Elisha, and if there is anyone in this story who can recognize the inadequacy of power and status, then surely it's Naaman. Naaman, who is only there because he's listened to the intervention of probably the lowest slave girl in his household. Naaman, who has only been made able to make the journey because a wise prophet intervened when a foolish king has descended into a self-obsessed tantrum. And now these two cultures come head to head. The culture of power that has led him to despair, and the culture of faith that has constantly brought him hope. And do you notice how once again the storyteller just paints in those little details that underline this clash of cultures? Naaman arrived at the door of Elisha's house with his horses and chariots, we are told. Now that's the kind of Old Testament equivalent of telling us that Naaman drove up to the house in a Porsche or a Ferrari. Most people at the time would consider themselves fortunate if they managed to travel around in an ox cart. Horses and chariots were the mode of transport for the celebrity elite. And Naaman, the helpless victim of the forces of nature, the powerless army captain who has got nowhere through his networks of influence and power, is given the chance to overcome the failings of those realities, but becomes the victim of nothing more than his own ego. Surely this prophet guy could come out and see me, he says. Surely he could be impressed by all my trappings of power and lay on some kind of religious ceremony that befits someone of my position. And this is where I want to remind you of that line that Elisha delivered when he intervened in the stalemate standoff in the royal courts of Israel. Send the man to me. That was how he was invited to approach God. Not as a celebrity, not as a victim, but as a human being, as a man. But he couldn't come as a man. He had to come as a foreign emissary, as a big shot demanding attention. And so, once again, the story grinds to a halt. And yes, you've noticed it perhaps, once again, the story moves forward through the faith of another group of nobodies. The nameless servants who accompanied Naaman and simply said, in our contemporary vernacular, get over yourself. If he'd given you the chance to do something to let you show off what a big shot you are, you'd have done it in a flash. So why not just climb down and accept what the guy says? Or if you want to express it theologically, are you prepared to accept God on God's terms? Or are you going to come to God with your own expectations and agendas? Because that way, Naaman, you just plunge yourself back into the way of despair. Cling on to your self-importance if you want to, but you of all people, after all the conversations and interventions you've been party to, should know that that will get you nowhere. Unfortunately, this entourage of nameless servants proves somewhat persuasive. And so Naaman does calm down, and Naaman stops acting like the king of Israel had behaved, and he goes into the water, washes 7 times, and comes out clean. Or to quote the narrative, he came out with the flesh of a young boy. And again, I think that the storyteller was very careful in their choice of words in that bit. Notice how the servants are recorded as addressing Naaman, my father, which stands as something of a contrast to that term master that was used when Naaman's situation was being passed up the chain of command, so to speak. And given the storyteller's attention to detail, I think that we're supposed to notice that and to recognise that they are appealing to Naaman's humanity, not his status. And surely that's what this whole episode should have taught Naaman. You've got leprosy, not because you're a commander of the army of Syria, but because you're a human being. And if you're going to be cured of your leprosy, you need to embrace the reality of why you've got it, not resort again to those things that have already proved utterly useless in its face. Send the man to me, says Elijah. I don't want to be just a man, says Naaman. Have the humility to be one, say the servants, and his flesh is restored to that of a boy. Do you remember what Jesus said in the Gospels? Unless you change and become like a child, you cannot enter the kingdom of God. Well, you could argue that Naaman offers us 2 ways of understanding that phrase, being like a child. Being like a child in throwing his tantrum and refusing to do as he was told, or being like a child in trusting what the prophet was asking him to do. I've heard some preachers describe this as the difference between being childlike and being childish. And I think it's a childlike faith that Jesus has in mind when he says what he did about entering God's kingdom as a child. And I think there's something really important for us to grasp in Naaman's experience, because there are those things that life will throw at us over which we have no control. And we might still look at the story of Naaman and say, well, at least you had a river to dip into. At least you had a prophet to tell you what to do. If I had the chance to stand in your shoes, I would take the option of hope in the face of despair. Well, as Jesus himself went on to remind people when he was invited to preach in the synagogue at Nazareth, recorded in Luke chapter 4, there were plenty of lepers in Israel at the time of Naaman the Syrian. There were plenty of people who saw themselves as part and parcel of God's community who never received the healing and wholeness that Naaman did. And it is yet for us to discover the full mysteries of God's purpose. But I don't think that stops us from considering and recognising those things over which we do have control. So just stay for a few moments longer with that scene outside of Elisha's door, when hope's journey has taken its course and healing and wholeness was within Naaman's grasp. All that stood between him and his cure was his own attitude of mind. And what about us? Are we prepared to accept what God offers, or do we want to dictate what God should give? It seems to me that the point the storyteller is seeking to make is that if Naaman wanted to receive the flesh of a child, he had to embrace the faith of a child, the faith that he'd seen demonstrated through a girl who was barely more than a child, through the nobodies in the story. Each showed their faith in a different way: the unstinting belief of a slave girl, the confident intervention of a prophet, and the patient logic of a group of respectful servants. But each of them had their faith. And perhaps for us then, the question that emerges from this is not what should I expect from God, but what within me, what things over which I do have control, are standing between me and whatever God might be seeking to offer me. Am I prepared to come as a child? Or am I clinging on to the baggage of wealth and status, or whatever else I may have accumulated and become attached to in my life's journey? The problem for Naaman was not that he arrived in a chariot, but he couldn't get out of the mindset of a proud chariot owner. So let me invite you again to spend some time with this story, and this time, so to speak, to enter it by trying to stand in the shoes of Naaman. And here's some questions that might help you to do that. What are the options that I'm facing at the moment? As I've looked at this story, I've tried to bring out that it was more than just a set of circumstances over which Naaman really had no control, but also a set of choices over which he did. Naaman chose to listen to the advice of a slave girl, but then landed in hot water by following the instructions of a misguided king. He chose the way of hope, again, by turning up at Elijah's door, but then nearly blew it by refusing to let go of his own self-importance. So, what are the voices that you're listening to at the moment? What are the options that you face? Which are the options of hope, and which are the options of despair? Or perhaps more to the point, are you choosing the right ones? And then perhaps another question is, what do I need to let go of? As I've acknowledged already, there may be some things that we're facing over which we really do have no control at the moment. But what do you have control over? And what do you need to release and change? For Naaman, it was his sense of self-importance, his preconceived expectations. For you, it may be those things or something entirely different. Perhaps it's past hurts and disappointments. Or maybe you're the exact opposite of Naaman and you simply feel like you're too unimportant to matter to God. Well, take your cue from the nobodies of this story. If it wasn't for them, we wouldn't be reading it. So as you come to God, what is the baggage that you know you're bringing? Be honest before God about that. But maybe also ask which of it you need to set down. And then finally, what is God asking me to do? Perhaps more than anything else, Naaman simply needed to learn to accept and to follow God's direction. All those gifts and status symbols he carried with him sort of betrayed the idea that he somehow felt he needed to earn God's favour or show himself worthy of it. And God's response through the prophet Elisha was, no, just humbly accept what I offer. Just humbly obey. And there were moments when he simply refused to do that, like the episode at Elisha's door. And there were moments when he half followed God, but then half did his own thing, like when he turned up in the courts of the king of Israel. But if this is about us, then we need to maybe consider whether and when we sometimes do the same. Just come like a child, says God. Just accept and trust and follow. So maybe simply spend some time considering what God might be saying to you at the moment, and don't be afraid to simply follow it. So I offer this story not as a cure for coronavirus or leprosy or anything else. That's for God to grant. But I think that through it, and through the example of Naaman, we have a chance to discover more of this God in the midst of those circumstances, however they may be affecting us. So I hope you can. And thanks for listening.